my pleasure is to introduce Professor Kevin Clements. He's Emeritus Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago and Director of the Toda Peace Institute in Japan. He was the Foundation Chair of the Peace and Conflict Studies Centre and Director of the New Zealand Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago. He was also the Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies and Foundation Director of the Australian Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Queensland. And he was also on the board of the European Centre for Conflict Prevention and a past president of the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office in Brussels. His latest book, Toward a Century of Peace, a dialogue on the role of civil society in peacebuilding, was written with Daisaku Ikeda and was published by Routledge in 2019. I see Daisaku is 93 years old and an amazing leader in Japan. So thank you very much, Kevin, for agreeing to share some of your insights with us. We look forward to your contributions now. Kia ora.
Kia ora mana, kia ora koutou. Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge all the wonderful work that Sonia and Joe and Manu and others are putting into this exploration of whether or not Rocket Lab is useful or not useful for New Zealand as a whole and for our national interests. You're doing wonderful work, and what I have to add is just sort of some additional bits and pieces which you've already covered to some extent in your slideshows, and you've covered also in your different contributions to thinking about Rocket Lab and the kinds of resistance we might make to it. So I have a little PowerPoint presentation, but one of the things which I wasn't able to do was to kind of follow. I have a whole series of things that we ought to be following. The first thing is I think we need to be following the board and their decision makers, and I've prepared a little slide on that in the presentation. Secondly, I think we need to follow the money flows because the Rocket Lab is, as Manu said, about to be floated on NASDAQ with highly inflated revenue expectations. The only way they can meet those revenue expectations is by forming closer and closer contacts with different parts of the Ministry of Defense. So following the money is something that somebody who's good at accountancy and good at following stock reports, everything else should be doing. Then thirdly, we need to follow the contractors. If you look at the Gunsmoke J payload, which was put up a few weeks ago, Sandia Laboratories in the US were the ones that were responsible for most of its manufacturing, and they are a nuclear laboratory. And then, as we've all been doing, we need to follow the payloads in much more minute detail with the best possible physical expertise that we can get. And then we need to kind of follow and ask ourselves why the government is being so enthusiastic. Manu's already hinted at the fact that the government thinks that this is just brilliant and wonderful because it's bringing in new technology and so forth. But not all technology is good technology, and not all technology is in the interest of New Zealand. So anyway, they're my follows. Let me see if I can get my little PowerPoint up here. Okay. So, I mean, the geopolitics of all of this, have to be seen in the context of New Zealand's peace movement's constant activity to kind of try and ensure that we're able to pursue a more or less independent and values-oriented foreign policy. And when you start looking at what's happening in Rocket Lab right now, it seems to contradict, and I'll get onto this later on, it certainly contradicts the Ngāi Mahuta's I thought very, very interesting and persuasive four Maori values, which she feels ought to be guiding our relationships. I like the photograph that Manu put off. It isn't rocket science. It is increasingly looking more and more like a US base. It looks like a US base. The people that are involved in it look like US contractors and defense contractors and venture capital companies that support US bases. The only thing that's missing are perimeter fences and either New Zealand military sentries or US military sentries. Increasingly, it's more and more like a military base. And I think that all of us need to be worried about it because it really does contradict nuclear-free New Zealand. In the 1980s, when millions of us decided that we wanted to remove ourselves from extended deterrence and be nuclear-free, we were saying two things. One is we had no desire to be protected by nuclear weapons and ensured that neither weapons nor nuclear-powered warships went into New Zealand ports. And we wanted some clear separation from nuclear alliance networks so that we could pursue a more independent foreign policy. If you look at the polling from that time, some were happy to be a non-nuclear ally of the US. But if that weren't possible and it wasn't possible, then Kiwis gave a lot of weight to being nuclear-free rather than a full member of ANZUS. And because of that, as you know, we suffered all kinds of indignities at the hand of the US and our Australian neighbours. We had restricted intelligence flows, we weren't invited to joint military exercising and all of that stuff, all of which I think was a good thing because it did enable us to begin really asking some fundamental questions about our foreign policy stance, whether or not we could play an independent role within an alliance framework. And we certainly didn't want anything to do with any part of the Western nuclear triad. And so I think that, you know, front and center, as a number of people have been saying in relation to this lab, is the question of whether or not it infringes the letter of our anti-nuclear legislation, if not the law of the anti-nuclear legislation. And the PACT Act Committee has written a very interesting letter, which Pauline and others have got right now, which is raising questions about those, you know, whether or not it should be the Prime Minister rather than the Minister of Business and Industry and Enterprise that is making these kinds of decisions, and whether PACT Act ought to be advising it. And I think that, you know, there's a kind of very strong argument to be made that we need some very strong civil society oversight with the best expertise that we can muster in relation to all of this if we're going to maintain a nuclear-free status, but more importantly, if we're going to ensure that we're not surreptitiously linked into any entangling connections which make us complicit in America's nuclear strategy. And I think that's exactly where this rocket lab is heading us. It's moving into very active support role to the US military and its Space Force. And as I've already said, that contradicts Ngāi Mahuta's Aotearoa's value-based foreign policy. It, I think, really strikes at the heart of her desire that we start building up our foreign policy from connections with Indigenous peoples, and it, in fact, it begins to contradict what we all want to see, which is kind of higher levels of self-determination and independence in our foreign policy formulation. The justifications for Rocket Lab being primarily for research and technical purposes are contradicted by most of Rocket Lab's military payloads. When Phil Twyford was down here, for example, I kept on probing him on this question, and he said, well, as far as he was concerned, most of Rocket Lab's payloads have been primarily research and technologically oriented. But as I pointed out, that's really contradicted by any kind of cursory analysis of Rocket Lab's military payloads. His response was, well, most of those payloads are still exploratory. And then he brings in sort of the civilian uses of them for surveillance purposes and so forth. But the reality is that the red line that New Zealand has between utility for technical and technological purposes and for operational purposes, it really has been breached. And it's being breached with almost every launch. And the Gunsmoke J launch, I think, was a particularly egregious example. He claims that was still largely a kind of a research enterprise, whereas it's very clear that the payload is delivering sort of real-time information to its owners and is enhancing US military targeting capacity, probably at a conventional level, but who knows, it could be at a nuclear level as well. each rocket launch and each US military payload, I think, places it closer and closer to what Prof Kevin calls the US kill line. If we send rockets into space, which can and will enhance US surveillance and targeting strategies, we're really complicit in their extrajudicial of terrorists and other undesirables by drone or precision bombing, and that's continuing. It started off with Barack Obama. It was continued by Donald Trump, and it's continuing by Joe Biden, who goes through every week. They have a sort of a kill list, and the US is beginning to get more and more accurate in terms of its ability to knock off different players that they find unacceptable. So Gunsmoke J was directly related to that kind of very precision targeting. Secondly, if we have no control over the software guiding these ostensibly research satellites, we've got no way of knowing whether they're being made operational or not. I mean, they could be launched for technical purposes, and then with a software switch suddenly become operational and start guiding conventional and/or nuclear weapons and operations over which we have no control. And it's playing a small but vital part in the militarization of space in the interests of the US Space Force. And I was also shocked to kind of see Nana Mahuta and others urging the development of a second rocket lab near Banks Peninsula as part of the sort of Artemis commitments. And again, it's being billed as an opportunity for New Zealand to get involved in a second launch program that will be critical in shooting people off to the moon and Mars and goodness knows where. But primarily, this is about space domination. And I think that's something which, again, ties us more closely to US military purposes. Now, if you look at the, sorry, I haven't had a chance to sort of really go through. I started looking at some of the financial links, incidentally, and I mean, I'm sure accountants will do a much better job of it than I, but I was really kind of shocked to sort of, if you start tracking back the companies that are associated with paying for Rocket Lab, they go straight to the heart of the military industrial complex. And if you look at Rocket Lab's board of directors, which is from their own website, I mean, if you look at this is the board, Peter Beck has got very strong links to the Pentagon, and as Manu said, Rocket Lab is basically all about defense. Mike Griffen is on the board of directors. He's an American former Undersecretary of Defense. He was head of the Missile Defense Agency and the Defense Innovation Unit in Defense. I mean, he's somebody who is deeply, deeply complicit in missile technology for nuclear and non-nuclear purposes. Sven Strohbad is an American financier. All of these guys have got very strong links to Silicon Valley and so forth. David Cowan is another American expert on cybersecurity. Ocko is an American specialist on cybersecurity and national defense. And there's only one Kiwi on the list. So this is a bit like a Sharif psychological experiment. You can imagine that even if Peter Beck had a strong desire to ensure that Rocket Lab's payloads were only technical and for research purposes, I mean, his 4 other members of the board would be able to kind of persuade him that there was indeed a kind of a moving light when the light was standing still. And in the event, he's demonstrated by his behavior that he doesn't resist Pentagon contracts. On the contrary, they need more and more Pentagon contracts to justify the kind of $4 billion revenue flow which they anticipate for this public launch. And then if you look at the executive leadership, I mean, there are 9 people there. Peter Beck is Kiwi. Adam Spice is the chief financial advisor, ex-Max Linear software firm. Sean O'Donnell is a Kiwi, but in charge of global operations, and he's been deeply embroiled in American missile assistance. Lars Hoffman, he's the American senior vice president. He used to work for SpaceX, National Security Space Strategy, ex-US Air Force, ex-Pentagon. Shane Fleming, American VP, was an ex-Lanzatech, very close connection to Silicon Valley again. Lachlan Matchett is a Kiwi who's in charge of propulsion. Sean de Mello's Australia with strong connections to American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Richard French, American Director of Business Development Strategies from NASA. Ehson Moslen is American Space Systems Chief Engineer, ex-TVAC Nano Satellite Systems. And if you start looking at their connections, they go back into many, many other military agencies. So there are only 3 Kiwis out of 9 in the executive leadership, and all the Americans have close links to Silicon Valley and the US military industrial complex, and so do the Kiwis as well. So being Kiwi national in this environment doesn't actually make you more independent. So I think we need to kind of be aware of the fact, and you know, what we need to start building up are the connections these people have with others who are right at the heart of the military establishment in the US. None of the board or executive leadership, I think, are primarily motivated by New Zealand's interests. On a basis of past work experience, technical expertise, it's difficult for Rocket Lab to argue that its senior leadership exists to serve the interests of Mahia, Auckland, or Aotearoa, New Zealand. Their interests lie in securing lucrative US defense contracts to justify their revenue announcements for the public float at NASDAQ. And on the basis of their published statements and past careers, few of the top team are interested in safeguarding a nuclear-free New Zealand or promoting civilian research, technological rockets. The company is by and large now an American one, which thrives or not on the basis of US defense contracts, thereby sucking New Zealand further into the American military machine. As one of only 9 rocket launching countries in the world, I mean, there's no doubt at all that, you know, in some future major international conflict, which is difficult to see right now, New Zealand would become a target, especially if we are lined up in the American line of battle. Anyone can see that payloads on Rocket Lab's rockets are primarily for US military purposes. And in the event of any future conflict, we'll be identified as a strong American ally, even if we're, you know, largely out of ANZUS. We'll be seen as providing a base for US military R&D and probably eventually a large number of operational satellites. So it seems to me we're being reincorporated into the American military machine by stealth. And this isn't okay if we wish to pursue a values-based foreign policy, are interested in a rules-based political order, want to prevent the militarization of space, and more importantly, if we're wanting to kind of be an independent country, making up our own minds, and ensuring a lot of blue water between us and non-nuclear states that are aligned so closely with the US in terms of extended deterrence strategies. So in terms of next steps, I think in addition to what Manu said, we need a national debate about the benefits of Rocket Lab to New Zealand. Just as we did with Waihopai and the other spy bases in the under Five Eyes. I think that, you know, New Zealanders really need to kind of have a good solid public debate about this so that we can ask ourselves, do we want to be stealthily reinserted into the American military industrial complex, probably in a much more closely integrated fashion than was the case, you know, when we were objecting so strongly to nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed warships. If New Zealanders as a whole see few benefits and many costs, I think the enterprise should be closed. If the government won't do this, and they seem to be enthralled to this whole notion that, you know, somehow or other we're on the cutting edge of space technology and exploration of space and pioneering, you know, outer galaxies and all this kind of stuff. If they're not willing to close it, then I think we really do need to work to make sure the Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Act review receives as many submissions as possible, submissions that are aimed at tightening its provisions, making sure that whoever is supervising and reviewing and authorizing payloads are not wittingly or unwittingly contradicting our anti-nuclear stance. I think we need to empower PACDAC as our primary civil society watchdog on approval processes. I think the New Zealand Prime Minister, rather than the Minister of MBI, should decide on whether payloads are malign or not and conform with our anti-nuclear legislation. And all of us, I think, need to be wary of entangling nuclear and conventional alliances. We've got to insist on absolutely clear separation between our national defense priorities and those of the US. Our political interests aren't served by serving the Pentagon and its affiliates. So for my money, I think we should close down the whole operation before we're sucked into activities that contradict our values-based foreign policy and our anti-nuclear legislation.
Thank you very much, Kevin. A lot to take in, and we will have question and answers. Hopefully there'll be some questions come through. One actually was for those that don't know, you suggested that PACDAC should be our primary watchdog. Can you explain what PACDAC is?
The Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control, I mean, does have a kind of a supervisory role in law on arms control and disarmament issues. And it has a primary purpose of making sure that the anti-nuclear legislation is upheld. So it's really crucial, it's really crucial that we have good people on PACDAC, and that it's reporting to the Minister of Arms Control and Disarmament, Phil Twyford, but that it also has some mechanism for ensuring direct links to the Prime Minister if it looks as though there are some major infringements of our anti-nuclear legislation.
And these are civilian citizens rather than politicians on this committee?
Civilian citizens. Wayne Mapp is the deputy chair. Yeah.
Why is the Prime Minister, do you think, passing on responsibility to the Minister for Disarmament, Phil Twyford, on this?
Well, I think she doesn't want to sort of be preoccupied with it and wants him to sort of take the heat on it. But he's not in cabinet, so he's out of cabinet. So I think that's kind of slightly problematic. I think in terms of New Zealand's nuclear-free legislation, it's the Prime Minister that ought to have full responsibility for ensuring that we're in compliance. So, I think that's something we should just keep pushing.
And Phil Twyford was responsible for drafting the cabinet principles around the payloads in 2019. Is that right? When he was Minister for Economic?
He was.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting the point you raised too of Nanaya's talking about the principles of kaitiakitanga as our sort of core values in terms of our activities as a nation in relation to space and having a kaitiaki role in space. I struggle to see how sort of supporting weapons development in space is connected to that, but that'll be an interesting conversation to have with her at some point in the near future. Another question was, what do you think the New Zealand government get out of supporting Rocket Lab, directly or indirectly, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think this is sort of just one of these sort of almost like childlike obsessions with, the space frontier and technology associated with it, and the fact that we're on the sort of cutting edge of rocket technology, which is identical to missile technology, and I think there's just a sort of a kind of a certain cognitive blindness on the part of our government in relation to this at the moment, which is assumed to be a good because of the income that is projected and because of the ostensible numbers of jobs it's creating. Yeah, I don't know. We weren't in New Zealand when this sort of first came up there.
There's another question about the recent disclosures of Rocket Lab's employment practices and a court decision that was considered by a number of commentators as one of the most serious breaches of New Zealand employment law and their own employment agreements with the employee in question. And I see Rocket Lab's been in the news in the last couple of days as well for the millions of dollars in wage subsidy that they received while making a significant profit, much higher than the loss that they'd made the previous year. So I think that was disclosed in their recent financials, and there's some questions over whether they should be and intend to pay back the wage subsidy that they took from the government. So yeah, there's a few issues going on for the company at the moment. So the 1987 nuclear-free legislation doesn't effectively implement Aotearoa's obligations under the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The Rocket Lab payloads are now creating questions about Aotearoa's compliance with the Nuclear Ban Treaty. That treaty's compliance mechanisms could be instituted if we don't get satisfaction from our own government in sorting this out. Do you think that's a realistic path?
I think that's a lovely suggestion, Andrew, and certainly in terms of the TPNW, that's a much stronger, in a way, that's a much stronger kind of prohibition than in our anti-nuclear legislation. Yeah, I think that we ought to be kind of hammering our obligations under that treaty.
And what's the mechanism for pursuing that?
Well, when it comes into force, there's a review conference which will be held in January next year. So we need to make sure that our government is doing all it can to ensure that it's in compliance, that we're doing what we can to kind of promote the abolition of nuclear weapons altogether, and that we're and again, there is sort of another interesting dynamic between the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is that, you know, the TPNW is much more radical than the NPT, which just creates a kind of a permanent series of nuclear powers and a permanent series of non-nuclear powers, but doesn't do anything to really delegitimate the nuclear the nuclear powers position or threaten use of such weapons.